Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Space Warfighter Talks. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association. I'm honored today to speak with Colonel Robert Epstein over at the Air Force Agency for Modeling and Simulation. Colonel Epstein, thanks so much for being with us today.
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You know, a lot of people would say, hey, why are we having an Air Force Agency for Modeling and Sim discussion on the Space Force Association Space Warfighter Talks? Well, I guarantee the audience that after this 40-minute episode, I think you have a very clear understanding of why it's imperative to talk to the commander of the Air Force Agency for Modeling and Simulation. Before we get going, sir, would you mind just providing a quick background, how you ended up, your career, and how you ended up as the commander of the Air Force Agency for Modeling and Simulation?
It's a long and sordid tale, but I'll do my best. Started out coming in 1995, went in as a computer systems analyst, so computer programmer. Got paroled for good behavior from the cyber comm career field and went off to flight school with the Navy, where I came out and decided to go electronic warfare and flew electronic warfare for a number of years, flying RC-135s, did a lot of SIGINT type of work. From there, have done all kinds of different things to include NATO tours. I served as a squadron commander at Eglin, part of the 53rd Wing, doing electronic warfare, one of the electronic warfare reprogramming squadrons. And then Train Assist Advise Command in Afghanistan, District of Washington. And after all these things, I got a phone call that says, hey, we need somebody down in Orlando, Florida to lead the Air Force Agency for Modeling and Simulation and help get an organization back on track. My first question was, I didn't know we had anything in Orlando. My second one was, yeah, put me in, coach. And so I've been down here just about 4 years. What I would tell you is we, the Air Force Agency for Modeling and Simulation, are part of Team Orlando, which is all 4 services here located in the Central Florida region. And really, it's the hub for modeling and simulation here in the United States right now. So it's been a strange and interesting journey that has taken me here, and a great ride so far.
And sir, besides being part of the best class to ever grace the halls of Air War College, we had the opportunity to meet and talk about a trip to Colorado Springs. But before we talk about your trip to Colorado Springs last year to learn more about space, let's talk about Blue Horizons and that program and how that may have educated, us together on, the importance of multi-domain operations, joint all-domain command and control. Talk a little bit about Blue Horizons and kind of the course, the curriculum, and the discussions that we had.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Hippie Wolf and I both were in the same class here at War College. We were both part of the Blue Horizons elective, which was really the chief saying, I've got all these research companies, the RAND Corporation, MITRES, who are out doing research for us. Why am I not putting these bright, shiny lieutenant colonels and colonels to work and have them doing research for us? So we did that. And we looked at what's it going to be like to fight the 2040 war. Let's look out for 25 years and start thinking, what technologies do we need to invest in? How do we need to do things different than the way we do it today so that we're going to be successful in a conflict in the future? And it was fantastic because it caused you to really throw off the current paradigms of the way we do business and reimagine what is possible and how would you do it. And so for me specifically, looking in the electronic warfare realm, how do you create realistic and relevant environments that allow us to do training for the future? How do I make sure that people are ready for these conflicts and are always expanding? Because the problem we get into, and this is where it's probably interesting to the Space Force, you can't go out and recreate and train in the space domain. It's just really difficult to do that. It's difficult to do that without giving away your capabilities. So the same with the aero domain today. Actually, COMAC, General Kelly, made a comment to me not too long ago, which is we have the same situation we have, or have something in common now with Israel, in that we can't go out on the ranges and actually demonstrate what we're going to do in combat. And we don't really have the ability to do it without putting it into the simulated environment. So either do it for real or you're doing it virtually to practice. So we're getting into these environments, and if you're going to do multi-domain operations, which gets back to your question, you have to think holistically. Because the space doesn't act as a space force by itself. And the air breathers aren't going to do their thing by themselves, nor is the Army, nor is our coalition. So you have to think holistically and start thinking about the Internet of Things and how things are all connected. How do you protect those things? How do you share data? How do you create the commonalities of data? And then how do you really create enhanced decision-making on that data that you can outthink and out-act?
Yeah, that's spot on. So let's talk a little bit about the Air Force. As you
Sure.
said, it's really difficult for air breathers to go out and fly on the ranges all the time. I mean, obviously, that's what we want to do. We want to fly in a real world environment. But the fact is, when you start force packaging a bunch of capabilities in the air domain together and then combine those with multi-domain capabilities, that's a really large force employment exercise that you can seldom replicate unless you involve the virtual constructive environment. Talk a little bit about how that's done for the Air Force today.
Well, so we came up with red flag. So I'll go back and talk about the Moody Suiter moment. So coming out of the Vietnam War, we very quickly realized that we needed to come up with ways to train against dissimilar platforms and do large-scale packaging exercises. So red flag was born, the aggressor squadrons were born. The problem is, for about the last 45 years, we've done incremental changes to improve, but we haven't really deviated from that model. So as the technology has improved and the capabilities have improved, the ranges and the capabilities on those ranges no longer provide what's going to be probably realistic in a modern threat environment. What do I mean by that? The threat density isn't there because we can't afford to get all the systems and put them out on the range. The airspace isn't large enough. I can't use the entire western half of the United States. I can't take out satellites. I can't GPS jam. I can't do all the things that I'm going to want to do because I expect them to be on a modern battlefield for fear of giving away capabilities and for shutting down LA Center, right? So with all these constraints in place, you have to go to something different. You have to create the ability to go to your red zone offense. And that's where modeling and simulation really comes in handy. We've always done that, right? Everything but war is simulation. But now, how do you leverage the technology to really create those realistic and relevant environments to give people the proper training and doing it repetitively versus the high cost of bringing airplanes to Las Vegas and having them all fly together in sometimes not such a safe way, not to mention the fact that I can't get all the assets there, the stress on the airframes, how do you actually use cyber or space assets in that type of an environment? Who's the training audience? Who's white cell? So it creates these complex relationships. And I think as the future goes and we embrace this new technology that's coming, you can create the opportunity to really train as a joint package the way we're going to go in combat. And that's what we ought to be doing.
Yeah, you're right. I completely agree. So the Air Force today, you've got a requirement. Who's your boss? Organizationally speaking, who is your boss? And then what is the edict that your boss has said, this is your job, this is what you must do?
Yeah, so we're a direct report as a FOA to A3T at the headquarters. So I work for training and readiness under the A3. AFAMS, when it was stood up in the mid-90s, late 90s, bounced around between a lot of different places, but it's under the ATSO-21, it realigned under the A3-5. When the A3 and the 5 split, we stayed with the 3 as current ops. Really, it's training and readiness. So the edict that came out under the OTTI flight plan, so the Operational Test and Training Infrastructure Plan, was we need to modernize our infrastructure on the way we do training, both on the ranges and virtually. And that's who we answer to. So the big thing there really gets into how do you create the opportunities that our air crew are able to go out there and train for major conflict, major near-peer competitors. The Space Force was always sort of an afterthought, and as their capabilities started coming from the onesie-twosies into we play with a larger structure, we started asking the question of how does the Space Force actually interact with the air breathers? How do we create the environments that all players are going to be together versus white carding your GPS is down or your SATCOM is down, which is typically what's done today, usually because of classification reasons.
Now you talk a little bit now, so that's already a potential issue is if you're a direct report, because you're a direct report to AFA3T, then how does the Space Force leverage the Air Force Agency for Modeling and Sim to cover down on some of their operational needs? And then, so say for example, the Space Force today was to ask, hey, here are our requirements for you to conduct your mission in support of the Space Force. How would that look, or what different actions would you take to comply with that requirement?
Yeah, so Hammerhead's comment. So as I've gone up through my chain, it's number one, if we're going to be doing both Air and Space Force, we need to get out from under the HAF, under A3, and probably be realigned under the DAF, right, the Department of the Air Force, so we can do both. About a little over a year ago, the Chief Modeling and Simulation Office was stood up with the Chief Modeling and Simulation Officer, Mr. Rich Tempelski, who is the CIMSO. He is under SAF AQ, but under Department of Air Force has equities in both camp, both Air Force and Space Force. We said that the AFAMS, the Air Force Agency for Modeling and Simulation, would have to realign somewhere underneath the Department of the Air Force so that we would be able to support both. Break. What we did about a year and a half ago, pre-COVID, was go a little bit on a tour through Colorado and out west to Los Angeles. I met with SMA as well as, or SMC and a number of the other organizations to go, great, how do we get a small branch or division inside of our organization that supports Space Force efforts? How do we ensure, and the first thing was, hey, you're not operating at the right classification levels. Well, we rectified that. But now it's going to be a matter of the few bodies, how do I leverage what the Air Force is doing and make sure that it's integrated with where the Space Force needs to go, that as a department, we work together, and then we can work with all of the other counterparts from the other services, who, by the way, are all located within a couple of 100 yards of this location.
And so after that event, so yeah, I remember that you came out to Colorado Springs and you visited with a bunch of folks. Could you talk a little bit about the specific visits, who you visited with, and then the after actions that took place based on that visit?
Yeah, so we went out to Los Angeles and met with a number of the directorates at SMC. We did meet with Kobayashi Maru. We met with Space Camp, and then went and did one of the Space Force. Well, at the time it was U.S. Air Force Space Command, right? But we met with Major General Kreider and a number of other people. And so it's how do we get the commonalities of data so that we can actually share the information back and forth? How do we actually build the requirements for what the Space Force is going to need for their training exercises and build that into sort of the larger scale exercises that we're going to do, so both space and air breathing operators are going to be getting the training they need. But we don't operate individually. You rarely are going to see space for space, cyber for cyber, or really, to be honest with you, the air breathers doing their own thing. So how do you create that environment to rehearse together? How do you put the command and control together so that when you do your large scale exercises like at an AOC or with a joint exercise, that the commanders know the different options that are going to be there for them, and then they can act on those things. So do I have a cyber round? Do I have a space round? Do I have an air breathing round? And then what is the right option to use at that time? Again, those are skill sets that have to be practiced, right? And if we're doing it for the first time in conflict, the likelihood of success goes down pretty close to zero.
And so what I'm hearing is everything's moving along swimmingly. You got the Space Force operational needs there at Air Force Agency for Modeling and Sim, and you as the commander are making sure that the multi-domain capabilities are being integrated into the modeling and sim environment. Did I hear that correctly, sir?
That's exactly wrong. Fantastic. No, they're not. So again, right now, things tend to be very linear and very stovepiped. And so we've created cylinders of excellence between the two services where the grassroots are talking to each other. I don't think anything formal is being done.
Got it. Yeah. And I think that's the opportunity that exists in this discussion, is just highlighting the fact that you are doing everything you can underneath the Department of the Air Force and really the headquarters Air Force to cover down on that important mission set. So from an air breathing perspective, and we're starting to get some questions from the audience, so I really do appreciate that. Please, if you've got questions for Colonel Epstein, please type them in the Q&A section, and we'll start to get to answering those. But one of the questions coming in is, how do you validate your modeled response by the other side? So the adversary gets a vote. How do you ensure that you are complying with the adversary doctrine to ensure that you get that part right?
So we're not specifically, excuse me. What we're doing is we're letting the intel agencies, we're letting the people who are developing the models develop their models. What we're looking at is, how do they integrate together? How are we actually creating those opportunities that a realistic validated model is being used in sort of the proper training scheme so that guys can actually see what they expect to see in combat. It's difficult to do that. I know the enemy gets a vote. What we're thinking is the future is probably going to have aggressor squadrons, but virtual aggressor squadrons. And to be honest with you, outsourcing, contracting. Why do I want to take frontline aviators or frontline operators from the Space Force and teach them enemy adversary tactics and have them trained to those? Because at the end of the day, you're not full of round anymore. You're a training asset. So I need the operators to be operators, and I want to figure out, how do I take the experienced guys who have chose to go to industry, put them into play and say, great, you get to be my aggressors, and create that realistic environment that we can constantly be updating due to intel, so the guys are getting the proper training. So it's a fair question. Probably more important is, how do you take into account things like latency so that everybody's in a fair fight? And what we've been looking at is, how do you take advantage of what the gaming industry is already doing? Online, multiplayer gaming. They've cracked the code for a lot of these things. We've been very resistant to embrace those things. And so I see that as the big sort of change in the way we're going to do things. Creating the digital twin of the world and creating these virtual environments that we can go and train and iterate and get good so that when we go and execute for real, we're ready to do.
Yeah, I remember working back at Nellis, talking to some of these aggressor pilots and some of the operators who needed to fly against the aggressors. They said, we don't need smart adversaries per se, because if you look at the flying hours of the adversary, it's minuscule compared to what our combat operators get. And all they said was, we just need metal to fly against. We need something for our radars to detect so that we can then impose our own tactics and techniques and procedures against the adversary. So that point about not necessarily, yes, definitely a thinking adversary, but not using the resource of operators to be that adversary. That's a very good point and well taken. Now, I do have to mention though, that intel piece that you pointed out that's an important piece. Right now, ACC does a really good job of going around the globe with tactics analysis teams and tactics analysis support elements to look at the emerging threat and ensure that emerging threat is incorporated into realistic training environments. How are you refreshing your training environment to accommodate for that emerging threat as the adversary develops new technology? Is that something that happens pretty quick, or does that take quite a bit of time?
So right now it takes a bit of time to get a validated model. We're talking years from the time it goes into the pipeline till it comes out as being validated. And what we find is it's usually late to need. So how do you do it differently? Well, you take advantage of what the phone industry or the internet or the gaming companies are doing today. If I develop a new weapon to go into Fortnite, I can literally code it, validate it, and drop it in immediately, and everybody has access to it. We should be doing the same thing with, hey, there's a new surface-to-air threat. We code it, we validate it, and boom, we set it in, and it actually updates to everybody. The way we do it today is we do that, and then we have to sell it or hand it off to a number of different vendors who put it into proprietary code and then sell it back to us as an update on their systems. And the models all don't operate the same, so we're not in a fair environment. So if you think about it, you have to change the entire way we're doing business to take advantage of those things. That as a new threat emerges, this is a process that's constantly evolving. And your input-output devices, your simulators, should just be interacting with the environment you create from them versus having to do everything on the environment. that's the paradigm shift. And I think leadership understands that and it's moving towards it. It's just a challenge to let go of the legacy process and legacy things that you've bought, get rid of that technical debt, and actually say, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it right. We're going to do it evolutionary.
Thank you, sir. I don't mean to put you too much on the spot. You had the opportunity, and what you're talking about, yeah, proprietary information is terrible. I think it really hamstrings our warfighting development and capability development. Can you talk, you did have the opportunity, I think, to get an overview of the Unified Data Library, the UDL. Can you talk just a little bit about how that concept can support AFAMS and how it could support a larger ecosystem?
Yeah, so, not to call them out directly, but, so Data One and the way we're looking at programming everything together, it should be a unified data library. It should be literally, you have a one-stop shop app store to go get everything you need. And it comes in a standardized format. So vendors who are developing microservices that go into the environment know the format the data is coming in, or at least know where to go get it. And I want the data stewards, the people who actually are responsible for keeping models and data up to date. It's updated one time, and then it propagates out to everybody else, versus having to have multiple different versions of things given to vendors and so on. So a data library, standardizing a place to go get data and standardizing the way data is ingested, I think is keys to the realm right now.
And I'm going to pull that thread just a little bit because there's been a lot of discussion about data standardization and formatting. There's probably pros and cons for data standardization, but I think it's difficult. Back to your proprietary point, it's difficult to tell everybody that you've got to standardize your data. It seems to be more beneficial to as you say, to integrate it into an architecture that can read the data and then distribute it. So what are your thoughts on data standardization?
Yeah, so it comes down to metadata tagging, and it comes down to APIs, right? How do I ingest the data? So I'm not saying that every data, I don't want everybody to say that this is the only way to do business. I was part of the ADA95 generation where we're going to code in ADA95 and that's it. It didn't make sense. It didn't survive contact. So saying that all data will be the same is probably a bit of a pipe dream, especially because you can't readjust that on the fly. But the way you tag your data, the way you're able to read it, ingest it, and then create it part of a larger ecosystem, I think that's going to be of the utmost importance, especially if you want to take the machine learning and the AI opportunities that are going to be available. We look at that and say, the data-centric environment is what's going to be key to moving this entire process forward.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I've got a couple more questions from the audience here. One is from Doc. Doc asks, does your modeling and sim support flow from RDT&E through to IOC, FOC, and ops, war games and exercises, or is it only in ops?
It's a good question. Thanks, Doc. So the way it works right now is test and training out of the Pentagon are working together and trying to do that. So that's probably your DT, OT, and then ops sort of side of the house. What we're seeing more and more is as the 5th gen platforms come on, the requirement for fidelity has gone up to the point where there's very little difference between test and training anymore and what they need to create, realistic environments. So that's sort of where we're at in the process. Analysis, so the A9 crowd, the test crowd, and the A3 crowd have all been stovepipes traditionally. And so we spend money in 3 different places to achieve very similar results. And so what we're seeing up at the higher levels is there opportunity and savings to create, something that I'm using to do DT for an aircraft. Why am I not able to take that same TMAT model or that same type of system and translate that into training or with slight modifications? So the answer is, are we really doing that now? No. Are we trying to get there? Absolutely. And it's being very deliberate to combine those. That was one of the reasons the Air Force Tri-Chair, which was the test community, the AQ community, and then the 3 community decided to create a chief modeling and simulation officer to create that czar who's looking across the acquisition platforms to say, okay, great, based on these things, what are going to be our priorities and how do we create efficiencies?
Thank you, sir. We've got another question from Chris Orovitz. He's asking, is your are your capabilities tied into NASIC and or other intel communities for emerging threats and how they impact the scenarios modeled?
Absolutely. That's the key. That's what we're trying to leverage. So as they put out the authoritative model, right? They're data stewards. They're the ones who should be putting out the truth data. What I don't want to do is go out to every vendor and say, hey, there's a T50 and I want to model that. So let's get everybody to go out there and do it differently. Can't do that. I want the truth guys to do it, and I want to bring that one time as the validated model into the system. And so we've been talking with the Intel community, and again, they're trying to align their budgeting to align with keeping things up to date and keeping it in the system.
Thank you for that, sir. I got another question from Shane Dykeman. It's kind of a long, a question about your vision and strategy. And really, as you probably come to the end of your tenure there as a commander, you've got to look back and reflect on everything that you've been able to accomplish based on the vision that you set for yourself. And so really, the question is leading to, what's your vision for AFAMS contributing to model-based systems engineering and acquisition activities across the U.S. Air Force and Space Force?
The vision was I brought in Dr. Alethea Duhan as my tech director, who was a systems engineer, and then she was also the chief technical officer to the chief modeling and simulation officer. The SIMSO is sort of working as a direct report to SAF-AQ, and he was doing modeling and simulation and digital engineering, and so sort of staying in that wheelhouse. So we were looking at model-based engineering and saying, how do you leverage what they're doing now in the digital engineering, that the way they're doing business, and bring that in to modeling and simulation. So what's the vision? I think they're becoming one and the same in the way we're going to see things for the future. Creating the office, helping stand up that office at the Pentagon under AQ to help align programs, we think is a very important part of that. For us, more on the enterprise requirements and implementation side of the house, it's basically supporting them in that effort.
Thank you, sir. Now, again, you've been able to accomplish a lot, and I suspect you have some unsatisfied needs that are out there. So what are some unsatisfied needs that modeling and sim that industry can help bring to bear?
So creating those common synthetic environments, reshaping the future, reshaping the paradigm, proving the technology out. So for example, creating the common synthetic training environment. How do you create that environment that's going to allow us to create that digital twin of the world for our aircraft to go and train in? How do you leverage the game technology today, online multiplayer game that has multi-level security, that's a zero trust, that's going to have data-centric, where you encrypt the data to create an environment to allow you to do those things. I need industry's help for those things. We've outsourced it because of how lean we've become, how deployed we've become. So industry are the thought leaders to do that. On the command and control side of the house, it's the same thing, because as JADC2, ABMS come online, the new AOC sort of being stood up, how are we going to stimulate those environments to allow our operators to train? And that's a challenge. So what are going to be the ways that you can stitch everything together, right? Whether that's API based, create that operating system, create that ecosystem. And then really it's going to be, how do you create those microservices that are going to go into it, the models, the data, the different ways of processing it, AI, and then input output devices to interoperate with that. That's the vision. It's going to take industry. I think technology's already there. It's going to be the thought leadership on how you put it together to really address the department's issues on how the Space Force and the Air Force are going to operate together and train together.
And I can't help but reflect back to an earlier comment you made about the stovepipes of excellence. So how do we develop the expertise necessary to get after a multi-domain modeling and sim environment? Where does that expertise come from?
It's a baited question, isn't it? So realistically, they've looked at creating the 13 Oscar, the the multi-domain officers. What they have to realize is we train our senior officers. They're all capabilities, but they're arrows in the quiver. They don't operate independently. And the other thing is the Space Force, the Air Force, and the way we're going to look at modeling and simulation, the way data flows, the way the environment is, whether it's 100 and 200 miles above the Earth, or it's 100 or 200 feet above the Earth, the concept's the same, the environment's the same, the electromagnetics the same. How do you put those things together, and then we can train that way? The only way you're going to do that is you got to create that common environment.
Sir, is there any way you can model and sim a day without space? Is that something that you've been able to do in your training environment to say, if we don't have SATCOM or GPS or indications and warning, is that something that you've been able to translate into any activities that you're doing there?
So no, the answer is no. So what lands up happening is it's still a white card event, or you're going to shut down our exercise. We don't want to do it. When I was an instructor at Randolph, the way you do that is, you turn off the GPS and then you take your pen, you go, all right, I got to go back to navigation the old way and figure out where I'm going. But that's exactly it is. You have to practice those environments where you go, your comm isn't going to work. Your GPS is going to be questionable. How are you going to function? How are you going to use the reserve modes and train the way you think you're really going to fight? And if you can't create those opportunities, really, they're negative training events. And that's what we've sort of realized as we move forward is, I don't want to give the wrong lessons to our aviators. I don't want them to believe it's always going to be there, or it's always going to work, it's always going to be pristine. So when you think about what we did at Red Flag, and again, I'm a product of Red Flag. The first time I flew in combat, I was slightly bored based on the fact that the most complex environment I flew was over the desert of Nellis, right, or over the Nevada ranges. How do you create that virtually today to really give those opportunities? That's what we need to do. And that's where you can sit there and say, I'm going to shut down your GPS, or I'm going to have a satellite that has to maneuver to defend itself. Well, what are the second and third order effects of that? How are you going to work through those problems? And again, I go back to what Connor made earlier. In combat should not be the first time you see things, right? And that's really what we look at here is, how do we enhance the readiness and lethality of the force?
Right. Sir, if people wanted to reach out and they might have a solution, how would they get a hold of, or how would they be part of the solution set to get more information on how to support AFAMS?
Yeah, so we're on a public-facing site, so ams.af.mil will get you to the Afam's webpage. We're on LinkedIn, where we try and post on a very regular basis, sort of trends on what's going on, and try and be a little bit of the thought leadership. So I tell you to follow us on LinkedIn. Reach out. Our contact information's there. So as I get ready to depart the fix, Colonel Tim Beers coming in from the 96th Wing will be coming in. But there's opportunities to help us grow and help the Air Force and the Space Force, to be honest, on how we're going to do business together. Because again, it's don't reinvent the wheel.
No, that's exactly right. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your support of the Space Force Association and being a member of SFA. It really is important that we bring the community together to have discussions like this. So thanks so much for taking time. Any closing comments from you about AFAMS?
What I would tell you is I'm really excited that the Space Force stood up. I am a believer that it was time to be their own service. Like the Air Force story, breaking away as the Army Air Corps to its own service, it was time for the Space Force to do that. I think the Space Force Association, the support you're providing is fantastic. So bravo to you, Hippie. But I think as we move forward, there is a desire for, the different deltas to think in their own little soda straws and say, hey, I'm worried about my own mission. I've got to be distinctive and unique. There are things when you say modeling and simulation where you go, it'd be better to put a branch into an existing organization and figure out how to use the infrastructure to support and leverage what's already being done versus staying in a stovepipe and reinventing and doing it yourself. That's the typical answer. So what I would say is, for those who are in the Space Force, reach out, let's figure out how to collaborate and graduate, and then take advantage of what the other services. So PEO STRI, PM Traces with the Marine Corps, and NOC TSD for the Navy are doing, so that we can actually leverage best practices across the department.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. I know how busy you are, so I really appreciate you taking a slice out of your day to talk with us about what's happening in the modeling and sim realm and what the Space Force can learn from what you've already accomplished there at AFAM. So, sir, thanks so much and have a great Air Force and Space Force Day.
Fantastic. To your listeners, thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. We'll talk soon. Bye now.